The wagon wheel groaned a final, weary complaint as it settled into the hardened mud of the yard. From the doorway of the sprawling, yet desolate ranch house, he watched her descend. She was a woman made of little more than shadow and bone, clutching a small girl to her chest as if the child were the last warmth left in the world. Barrett was a man of immense size, a mountain built not of timber and stone, but of solid flesh and deep, abiding solitude. His sheer bulk was so pronounced the townsfolk spoke of him in cruel whispers, calling him the too fat cowboy, a creature of the plains more than a man. He had paid for a housekeeper, a transaction as cold and practical as trading cattle for feed. He expected calloused hands and a bowed head. He did not expect the stillness in her eyes, a quiet depth that had seen too much of the world's cruelty and had refused to be broken by it. Her name was Clara, and the child, clutching a worn rag doll, was her daughter, Lily. The arrangement was laid bare between them in the frigid air, unspoken, but absolute. She would work for shelter. He would provide it. There would be no sentiment. His home was a shell, a place where grief had long ago scoured away any trace of comfort. He had no warmth to offer, for his own heart was a frozen, barren thing, a landscape of ice and memory he never allowed anyone to cross. He simply nodded once, a curt, dismissive gesture, and retreated back into the gloom of the house, leaving her standing under the vast, indifferent sky. He was offering a roof, not a refuge. The first night was a symphony of silence, broken only by the mournful scrape of wind against the log walls and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the little girl. Clara moved through the main room with a ghostly quietness, finding a corner for her meager belongings and fashioning a small bed for Lily from a crate and her own shawl. The ranch house was large but sterile, the air thin and cold with disuse. It was the home of a man who did not live, but merely existed. A tin plate and a single cup sat by the cold hearth. A heavy saddle, its leather cracked but well-oiled, was draped over a stand, the only object that seemed to hold any life. Barrett sat in a reinforced chair in the deepest shadows, a looming shape that was more present than person. He did not speak, did not acknowledge her beyond a glance. He was a sentinel guarding a tomb, and she and her child were unwelcome ghosts. Clara hummed a low, fractured lullaby to her daughter. The sound was so fragile it seemed to shatter against the oppressive stillness. For a moment, Barrett's massive hand tightened on the arm of his chair. A sound like that had not been heard within these walls for years, for a lifetime. It was the same tune his Sarah used to sing. It was an intrusion, a flicker of light in a place he had deliberately kept dark, and he felt a cold, unfamiliar resentment stir within him. He wanted the silence back. It was his penance, his shield. But the soft humming continued, a thread of gentle defiance against the crushing weight of his sorrow. Days bled into weeks, each one marked by the quiet, relentless rhythm of Clara's work. She did not speak to him, did not ask for his help or his permission. She simply began to reclaim the house from the ghosts that possessed it. She scrubbed the soot from the stones of the hearth until they shone, mended the threadbare curtains with neat, invisible stitches, and coaxed a stubborn, pale light into the dusty corners. The scent of wood smoke and old sorrow was slowly replaced by the aroma of baking bread and wild herbs she gathered from the edge of the plains. She moved with a silent grace, her hands never idle. She mended a tear in his coat, leaving it folded on his chair without a word. She found a cracked ceramic mug, and instead of discarding it, she carefully sealed the fracture with pine pitch, its imperfection a testament to her belief that nothing was too broken to be made useful again. Each small act was a chipping away at the fortress of his isolation. He watched her from his chair, a silent observer of this quiet transformation. He had built these walls to keep the world out, to protect the raw, festering wound of his past. But she was not tearing them down. She was simply planting a garden at their base, tending it with a patience that was more powerful than any siege. He felt the foundations of his grief begin to shift, disturbed by the persistent, growing warmth she brought into his world. Barrett found himself tracking her movements, the small rituals of her day. The way she tested the heat of the stove with a wetted finger, the soft frown of concentration on her face as she taught Lily a little clapping game, the gentle way she spoke to the herbs she planted in a small box on the windowsill. He had forgotten what life looked like. He had forgotten the simple, steady beat of a functioning home. One evening he returned from mending a fence line to find a fire crackling in the hearth, a thick stew bubbling in the pot, and his mended coat hanging by the door. He stopped, framed in the doorway, a behemoth caught off guard by a feeling so alien he could not name it. It felt like coming home, a sensation he had long since buried with his wife, Sarah, and their son, Daniel. He looked at Clara, who merely glanced up from her sewing before returning to her work, her expression unreadable. She offered him this comfort without expectation, without demand. It was a gift freely given, and it terrified him more than any threat. To accept it would be to admit he was in need, that the stone he had made of his heart was capable of feeling anything at all. He ate the stew in silence, but the warmth of it spread through him, a traitorous heat that had nothing to do with the fire. The ice was not cracking, but it was beginning to sweat. A thought came from a place deep within him he thought had frozen solid forever. The breaking point arrived not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a thin, reedy wail that cut through the house's heavy silence. For hours, little Lily had been crying, a raw, inconsolable sound of distress that frayed the edges of the day. Clara walked the floorboards, her own face etched with exhaustion, her gentle rocking and soft lullabies failing to soothe the child. Barrett remained in his corner, a stone statue, the noise grating on him, digging up memories he fought to keep buried. The sound of a crying child was the sound of his own failure, the echo of a loss so profound it had unmade him. He tried to block it out, to retreat further into his cold shell, but the sound was relentless. Finally, unable to bear Clara's weary desperation any longer, he stood. He was a terrifying sight, a man whose sheer size filled the room, his face a mask of grim resolve. He lumbered towards her, and Clara flinched, instinctively pulling the child closer. He stopped, holding out his hands. They were enormous, calloused, and scarred from years of hard labor and unforgiving wilderness. They looked as if they could crush granite. Without a word, he waited. Clara hesitated for only a second before her exhaustion won. She carefully placed the wailing toddler into his massive palms. The crying stopped instantly. Lily, her small face streaked with tears, stared up at the mountain of a man holding her. Her tiny hand uncurled and her fingers wrapped around his thick thumb. And there, against the broad, unmoving chest of the man the world saw as a fat, brutish cowboy, the little girl sighed and fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Barrett stood frozen, the fragile warmth of the child seeping through his shirt, a searing heat against the ice of his heart. As if summoned by the shift in the home's emotional climate, the world outside decided to turn. The sky darkened to a slate gray, and a bitter wind began to claw at the house, its howl a prelude to the blizzard that would follow. Within hours, the world was erased, buried under a thick, suffocating blanket of white. The ranch house became an island, a tiny bastion against the fury of the storm. It was in this forced intimacy, this white-walled prison, that Lily's fever began. Her skin, once cool and soft, burned with a dry, unnatural heat. Her breaths came in small, sharp gasps. The storm outside was a physical thing, a force of nature, but the storm of fear that descended inside the house was far more powerful. For Clara, it was the terror of a mother, helpless and alone. For Barrett, it was a ghost. He had seen this fever before. He had felt this same helpless dread as he watched the life fade from his own son. The past he had so carefully walled off came rushing back, and for the first time in years, the stone giant felt the sharp, brutal sting of fear, not for himself, but for the tiny life he had held in his hands only days before. He and Clara were no longer two separate souls sharing a space. They were two people bound by a single, desperate purpose, to keep a fragile flame from being extinguished by the encroaching dark. They worked together through the long, howling night, a silent, frantic pact forged in the flickering firelight. He kept the hearth roaring, venturing into the blinding storm for more wood, his huge frame a bulwark against the wind. He melted snow, his hands steady despite the tremor he felt deep inside. Clara never left the child's side, bathing her forehead with cool cloths, whispering reassurances that were prayers. The silence between them was no longer one of distance, but of shared, desperate focus. As dawn approached, with the storm still raging and the fever unbroken, the walls they had maintained between them finally crumbled into dust. She spoke first, her voice a raw whisper. She told him of her husband, a good man taken by cholera on the trail west, of the whispered judgment of the wagon train, of the fear of being a woman alone with a child in a world that had no place for them. Then, in a voice rough from years of disuse, Barrett spoke. He told her of his Sarah, and of little Daniel. He spoke of the fever that had swept through their homestead like a prairie fire, leaving him standing in a world of ash. He described the silence that had followed. A silence so complete he had decided to become a part of it, retreating to this ranch where he could be as cold and empty as his heart. In that dark, storm-tossed house, their two immense sorrows met, not to compound the grief, but to finally share its terrible weight. The blizzard broke on the third day, leaving a world of pristine, blinding white. Lily's fever had broken with it, leaving her weak but blessedly cool. The ranch was nearly out of flour, and their small stock of medicinal herbs was gone. A trip to the town of Redemption was a necessity. The journey was slow, the air crisp and cold. When they walked down the town's main street, a path carved through high snow drifts, a hush fell over the few people who were out. They stared first at the hulking figure of Barrett, then at the pale woman walking beside him, the sleeping child bundled in her arms. From the door of the mercantile, a man emerged, his face a sneer of smug authority. It was Garrett, her late husband's brother. "Clara," he said, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "The Lord has seen fit to deliver you from the wilderness. The child and you will come with me. It is your duty." He reached for her arm, his eyes filled with a greedy, proprietary light. He saw her not as family, but as an asset, a pair of hands to work his farm, and a child to be molded. The town watched, a silent jury, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They had all heard the whispers about Barrett, the too fat cowboy who lived like a beast. They expected him to do nothing, or to react with brutish violence. They waited for the widow's sad story to take another tragic turn. Barrett did not roar. He did not raise his fists. He simply moved, placing his massive body between Clara and Garrett with a quiet finality that was more intimidating than any threat. He was no longer a stooped recluse. He stood to his full, formidable height, an immovable object of pure resolve. His shadow engulfed Garrett, plunging him into a sudden, chilling darkness. The air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the cold. Garrett looked up into Barrett's face and saw not the vacant eyes of a hermit, but the sharp, clear gaze of a protector. It was a look that spoke of lines drawn and boundaries set. "She and the girl," Barrett said, his voice a low rumble, not of anger, but of absolute certainty, a geological fact, "are with me." The words hung in the frozen air, a declaration that echoed off the silent storefronts. It was a claim, a shield, a promise. Garrett, for all his bluster, was a coward. He saw in Barrett's eyes a conviction he could never match. He stammered, took a half-step back, and then melted back into the crowd, his authority shattered. The townsfolk stared, their understanding of the big rancher irrevocably altered. Inside the store, Barrett purchased their supplies. Just before they left, his gaze fell upon a small, simple silver locket behind the glass counter. He bought it, and as they stepped back into the sunlight, he pressed it into Clara's hand. He did not need to say what it meant. In the silent language they now shared, it was a vow. The journey back to the ranch was made in a new kind of silence. It was not the cold, empty silence of their beginning, nor the tense, desperate silence of the storm. It was a quiet filled with warmth, a shared peace that settled over them like freshly fallen snow. Clara held the silver locket in her hand, its smooth, cool weight a tangible symbol of the promise he had made. When they reached the house, the sun was setting, casting long, golden fingers of light across the valley. The home they entered was no longer his cold refuge or her temporary shelter. It was theirs. The seasons turned, a gentle rhythm of planting and harvesting, of long winter nights by the fire and bright summer mornings. The fear in Clara's eyes was replaced by a serene strength. The harsh, grieving lines around Barrett's mouth and eyes softened, smoothed away by the sound of a child's laughter. He was still a man of few words, but his actions spoke a language of profound devotion. He carved intricate animals for Lily from scraps of pine, his massive hands, once tools of survival, now instruments of joy. He taught her the names of the birds and the secrets of the plains. Clara filled the home with life, with the scent of baking and the sound of her humming, no longer a fractured, lonely tune, but a melody of deep contentment. He had been a man entombed by his past, a giant who believed his heart was nothing more than cold stone, mocked by the world for the size of his body. But a resilient woman and her child had shown him that even the hardest stone could be worn away by the patient, persistent love of a family, proving that the greatest strength was found not in a man's size, but in the gentle weight of a little girl in his arms, and the quiet presence of a woman who had taught him how to live again.